Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all for making time on your lunch break today to join this conversation. We're thrilled to present part one of a two-part webinar series on SNAP changes in the federal reconciliation bill that was passed over the summer. This is such a big topic. There were so many changes that we had to split it into two 1-hour webinars and are thrilled to dive in today to a primer on all of the changes that were included. And then next week, at the end of this webinar, we'll include some information on next week's part two webinar so that you can join that as well. To kick us off today, I want to introduce myself and Advocates for Ohio's Future. I'm Sarah Hudasek. I'm the Coalition Manager of Advocates for Ohio's Future, and we are a nonpartisan coalition of health and human service organizations that are focused on budget and policy solutions that help Ohioans live better lives. And I'm privileged every day to be able to work with the incredible panelists who are on this webinar, who are experts on SNAP and have been following the many different versions of the reconciliation bill and then spending their summer really analyzing and breaking down what it means for Ohioans and what we want to share with all of you so that you all know today to take back to your communities. I want to share just some brief housekeeping items about the webinar today. This webinar is being recorded in full. It will be sent out via email to everyone who registered for the webinar this afternoon. If you missed the email or you want to check on our website for the materials as well, you can find that on our website under the webinars link. And if you have a question throughout the webinar, please send it in the Q&A box. We're going to hold all of the questions until the very end of the webinar at the end of the presentations, and we will answer all of your questions then. So without further ado, I am thrilled to turn it over to Rachel Cahill, visiting fellow at the Center for Community Solutions, to introduce herself, introduce the other panelists, and we'll dive in today.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sarah. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. I know it's a Friday and it's lunchtime, so thanks for spending some time with us. I am Rachel Cahill. I'm a visiting fellow with the Center for Community Solutions. I've been doing SNAP advocacy policy work for some time now and appreciate the opportunity to talk about such big changes to this important program with all of you today. I'll pass it to Hope to introduce herself.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks everyone for joining us on this Friday. My name is Hope Lane-Gavin. I serve as the Director of Nutrition Policy and Programs with the Ohio Association of Foodbanks. We at the Association of Foodbanks, we represent Ohio's 12 Feeding America food banks and roughly 3,600 hunger relief partners, agencies, soup kitchens, homeless shelters in all 88 counties in the state. And I will pass to my colleague, John Honeck.
Thank you, Hope, and good afternoon, everyone. John Honeck. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Job and Family Services Directors Association. We represent all of the county job and family service agencies across the state of Ohio. So we are responsible for providing eligibility determination services for the SNAP program and the Medicaid program and child care. And we are also often responsible for delivering senior services and also TANF services to low-income residents across the state of Ohio. So we're there kind of at the center of delivering services and determining eligibility across the state. And I'm really looking forward to speaking with you this afternoon about this federal legislation because it will create some major changes in the way we're doing business.
Okay, well, I am going to get started walking through kind of the big picture overview of what happened with SNAP in reconciliation. I'm going to use that term, tell you what it means. We are really staying high level today, so if you are a super nerd and have questions, we do have the Q&A. You can put them in and we'll address as many as we can, but that is why we are doing a separate webinar to go deeper on some of this stuff. So to start off, what was reconciliation and how did it happen? So just a little bit on the legislative process for those of you who are not following it closely. Reconciliation is a term of art that really is a special process that Congress can use to pass tax and spending legislation, and you only need a simple majority. So unlike most other legislation in the Senate, where you need 60 votes of a threshold for reconciliation as a process, only a majority was needed. There are lots of other terms for this. It's also called HR 1, OBBA, which is short for One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OB3. I've started hearing some people calling it. It's all the same big federal law. I'm going to refer to it as reconciliation or HR 1 because that's what comes naturally to me. So as I mentioned, it passed a very slim majority in the Senate at the beginning of July. It was a 51-50 vote with the vice president breaking the tie. It then very quickly passed the House by a 4-vote majority, and then it was signed by President Trump on July 4th. So we have only known about this legislation and the details of it for about 2 months, and we are still waiting for a lot of the guidance that needs to flow out of it because it did come together very quickly and there's a lot of interpretation needed for it. So the big goal of this package, if you were following the debate, was really to make permanent the 2017 tax cuts and introduce more spending for immigration enforcement and specifically deportations. SNAP and Medicaid were targeted for cuts really as pay-fors for this larger spending package. I think that, so if you have questions about the policy why behind some of the changes we're going to talk about, it's important to know this context that these are 2 programs that have a decent amount of federal spending. And so they were cut in by a pretty big margin, almost 200 billion out of the SNAP program, in the order of $1 trillion in the Medicaid universe. So they were pay-fors. That's kind of an important concept to understand. And even with that, those pay-fors, this bill does still increase the federal deficit by about 3.3 trillion is the most recent estimate that I've seen. So that's what reconciliation was and how we kind of got to this moment of having some really big changes in the SNAP program that we want to talk through today. So I'm breaking them down into 3 buckets. We're going to talk about funding cuts, eligibility cuts, and benefit cuts. So the first and most impactful, especially for today's conversation, is the funding cuts to the state and local governments that operate SNAP. So the first thing that this bill does is it reduces the way that the administration of SNAP is paid for. Historically, that has been a 50-50 split. So the state government, or in our case, the county and state governments, puts up $1 and the federal government matches it with $1. So that's a 50-50% split. Starting in October of 2026, that's going to shift to being a 75 state or local contribution and only a 25% federal match. So it's going to get more expensive to administer SNAP, just as it is today. We're going to have to put in more dollars to run the program. So that's the smaller of the 2 funding cuts that came through. The really big structural change that occurred is that it effectively ends the federal guarantee to pay for 100% of the SNAP benefits themselves. So the dollars that go on an EBT card that families are able to use to purchase groceries. Starting in October of 2027, I'm gonna try to use real dates instead of federal fiscal year dates. It requires states to start paying between 5 and 15% of the benefits if their payment error rate for SNAP exceeds 6%. So I'm going to say this a couple different ways and a couple different times because it is confusing. But effectively, the only way for us to stay with the current way SNAP is funded, which is 100% federally funded benefit, is if we have a payment error rate in SNAP that is less than 6%. So I have 3 kids in elementary school. They get grades and a 94% is an A. So we have to do better than a 94%, right? We have to get a more than just a regular A in order to not have a benefit cost share in the program. So I wrote about this in advance of the bill passing and can drop some links in the chat later about a paper I wrote on this. But effectively, the biggest harm that I see this doing is that it really weakens SNAP's ability to act as an economic stimulus in the future, because SNAP is designed as a counter cyclical program, meaning it grows when need grows and it shrinks when need shrinks. And so the problem with a cost shift like this to the state is the federal government is capable of extra spending in times of recession, but the state government is much less prepared for that type of spending. So this is a very big change to the way SNAP is funded. And the last thing is it ends federal funding for SNAP education. It's called SNAP Ed. It's really a nutrition education program that's been around for a long time. That effectively ends at the end of this month, September 30th of 2025, unless Congress, does something different, comes up with an appropriation. That was mandatory spending is how we talk about it, and it's no longer protected as part of federal law. So that is another big funding cut that happened. All right, I know that was a lot on that slide. Don't have as much detail I'm gonna go through on the next two. I'm just gonna touch on them. We can do future webinars or future trainings on them because I know many of you participating do direct service and are gonna be helping households with these upcoming eligibility cuts, but there's really two big ones that I wanted to talk through. The first one is a vast expansion of what are sometimes called work requirements, but really people who must report work activity to continue receiving SNAP. It's also sometimes called the 3-month time limit because it means individuals are limited to 3 months of SNAP benefits out of every 3 years, unless they can prove that they have worked or volunteered or participated in training for 80 or more hours a month. So that expansion expands from adults. It previously was 18 to 54-year-olds, and now that expands to older adults as well. So it includes 55 to 64-year-olds. So only 65 and older are exempt. Even though the SNAP program defines elderly as 60 and over, this is now including a group of individuals in the time limit that have previously been considered elderly and fully exempt from any kind of work requirement. It also extends to parents for the first time. And so that means it includes adults living with children aged 14 to 17. Historically, it's only applied to adults living with 18, who are 18 and over. So households with children have always been excluded from the time limit, and this is the first time that they're going to be impacted. And so altogether, we don't really have a solid estimate of this yet. At least I don't. The best one I've seen is about 53,000 Ohioans may be impacted by this in some way because they will have a new work reporting requirement. That doesn't mean that there are 53,000 adults in this group who aren't working. Most of them are working, but they now have a new work reporting requirement, and that's going to add a lot of paperwork and a lot of bureaucracy that we're going to have to account for. So the other big eligibility cut is that this bill eliminated SNAP eligibility for several different groups of legally present immigrants. So if you are not familiar with SNAP, SNAP has always not been available to undocumented immigrants, but there are several groups of legally present immigrants who it has been accessible to. That includes refugees, people who are asylees, who have been granted asylum status, and several other categories of humanitarian parole. One example is the special visa holders from Afghanistan and Iraq, people who worked with the US military and are here with a special visa. That's an example of a group that has been eligible for SNAP, and that eligibility was eliminated with this bill. We do not have an implementation date yet for that provision, really for either of these provisions. We don't have an exact date yet for when Ohio will be implementing them, but they were in the law, and we expect them to be implemented relatively soon. So again, we don't have a great estimate of this because many of these folks, refugees, for example, they can adjust their status to a legal permanent resident. And so they may or may not be impacted by this law, but the best estimate I've seen so far is maybe in the order of 7 to maybe 10,000 Ohioans who may be impacted by this provision. Okay, last one for me. That is the benefits cuts. Now I would put both of these as kind of death by 1,000 paper cuts, or maybe better said, like nickel and diming SNAP recipients. Maybe that's a better way to put it. So one change is that it restricts the way the state can simplify how utilities are calculated in the SNAP benefit calculation. It's like other provisions, it's going to require more documentation and verification for folks that we already had another way of knowing that they had a utility cost. because they got a benefit from heating assistance. And effectively now we're saying that proxy is not allowed. You're going to have to reprove that you have a deduction for utilities. So again, it's a relatively small savings and mostly a paperwork headache that folks are going to do. But knowing that this overall law was about to pay for, this was a way to squeeze, a few more $1 billion out of SNAP spending. And the other provision it's kind of like that is the thrifty food plan. You might have heard a lot about this if you followed the last Farm Bill conversations. But it's essentially how SNAP benefits are calculated, that like very cheapest cost meal that you could purchase. And essentially this law said that any future reevaluation of that thrifty food plan has to be cost neutral. And so this just kind of erodes the value of the benefit over time. SNAP will still adjust for inflation annually as it does now, but there can't be future reevaluations of how people shop and cook that could increase the cost of the benefit. And so we'll see that erosion happen more in the long run than we'll see that in the short run. All right, so this is just a quick timeline. I put them into two buckets because there's a lot of dates that were on those slides and a lot of provisions. So one bucket, and this is maybe a good reference slide for the future, is what I call soon. Either upon enactment, meaning that they're in effect now, but we're waiting for guidance to implement. Some guidance actually just came out yesterday, so we may know more about this soon. But the expansion of the time limit, the immigrant eligibility provisions, SNAP Ed, and the restriction on utility deductions, those are all relatively soon implementation, if not already in place. The later implementations include the cost share for the state for that 75-25 split I was talking about at the beginning. That goes into effect next October, so we have just over a year till that's into effect. And really importantly, I want to emphasize that the cost share for the benefits themselves, that really big, upwards of potentially 300 million cost to the state, which I know Hope's going to talk more about, that even though that is would have to start being paid in October of 2027, the year that it's based on is actually the year that's about to begin. So it's the year that begins October 1st of 2025 through September of 2026. So we are going to be on the clock, so to speak, to be really pushing to lower our payment error rate right now. Like it's go time. We have to be focused on this. Okay, so I think with that, I am going to pass it over to Hope to talk a little bit about those state budget implications.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Gonna get into the next slide. Awesome, thank you. So we'll get started here again, talking about the administrative cost shift that will occur. So as Rachel just shared, the administrative cost shift will occur in Ohio's current biennium. And this is approximately $70 million a year, beginning again in this current biennium, so next October 1st of 2026. I recognize that the passage of OBBBA has led to much more attention on the program and a heightened desire to better understand it. In other words, I understand that not all of you are SNAP nerds like Rachel, John, and I. So I just wanted to take a second to talk about the administrative costs in the program. They are like the cost to actually run the program itself. So from salaries for staff to rent and utilities on the physical buildings to the cost of the physical SNAP cards and everything in between. So moving on to the benefits cost share. The benefits cost share begins on October 1st of 2027. And so these decisions will be made by the next governor of Ohio and the next General Assembly, or the 137th General Assembly. Ohio's federal fiscal year 2024 error rate, which is 9%, would result in a shift of approximately $320 million per year, as Rachel highlighted before. I have a star here because I wanted to ensure to expound a bit on this bullet point. Ohio's most recent error rate from federal fiscal year 2024 is 9%. And at this current error rate, at current caseload of about 1.5 million Ohioans on the program, Ohio's benefit cost share would be about, like I said, $320 million per year. However, it's really important to note here that our cost share, as Rachel highlighted earlier, beginning in fiscal year 2028 will not be based on this current error rate, but rather the error rate of either fiscal year 2025 or fiscal year 2026, whichever is lowest. So we have an opportunity now, as Rachel highlighted, to impact what that error rate is. It's also important to highlight that that $320 million figure is based on a caseload that will inevitably decrease due to eligibility changes from the bill. So research demonstrates about 720,000 families in Ohio will lose some or all of their SNAP benefits based on the eligibility changes that we just discussed and cuts to the Thrifty Food Plan, as we just talked about. But there are opportunities, like Rachel was highlighting, to make improvements and investments to impact this federal fiscal year 2026 error rate to mitigate the state cost share. Next slide. Thanks, Sarah. So just want to continue to reiterate that there is an opportunity here to impact the federal fiscal year 2026 error rate, and that time is now. Additional state investment will be needed to ensure counties have the resources, technology, and staff to reduce the error rate without cutting benefits and access, and that the state agency itself has the capacity to implement policy changes that will make for more efficient processes. Having to enact such significant eligibility changes while also working to get the error rate down to mitigate the cost share will be quite a delicate dance, and it's crucial that eligible and food insecure people are not left behind. The food insecurity in Ohio is high as it's been since 2016 at about 15.3% right now. Pressure on our state's food bank network is unsustainable, and we cannot afford or to absorb SNAP cuts, nor can we compete with SNAP for state funding in the next budget. And it's important to talk about who are we talking about when we talk about who's on SNAP, right? What kind of folks, what kind of Ohioans are we talking about? 62% of SNAP participants in Ohio are families with children, and 42% are in families with members who are older adults or disabled. Next slide. So USDA implementation implementation guidance is to come likely in phases. In Ohio State's operating budget that was just passed for the state fiscal years 2026 and state fiscal year 2027 was passed on June 30th, 2025, a few days before the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was passed on July 4th of 2025. So I share that because the state legislature should consider a budget correction or a budget amendment or a budget adjustment prior to federal fiscal year 2027 to account for SNAP administrative cost shift and other policy impacts change in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. There was actually a small guidance released by USDA yesterday indicating that we should know a little bit more about what is to come by the end of this month. I also wanted to just briefly touch on some other federal vehicles that are moving that could impact some of these things that we're talking about today. The federal government needs to pass an appropriations package or a continuing resolution to keep the government open by the end of this month. If the government heads towards a shutdown and that shutdown lasts longer than 30 days, it could be difficult for USDA to continue operations. Additionally, the federal farm bill, the traditional vehicle to change SNAP policy, was due for reauthorization in 2023, but instead is also operating on a continuing resolution. There is some appetite in Congress right now to consider a slimmed down version of the federal farm bill this current Congress, which could have further impacts on the SNAP program and some of these One Big Beautiful Bill Act changes. And I think that is it for me. So I'm going to go ahead and pass to my colleague, John.
Okay, thank you, Hope. And it's good to be with you all this afternoon. Again, John Honeck with the Job and Family Service Directors Association. I want to start out by just giving a little bit of background about the county job and family service system we have today in the state of Ohio. Ohio does things a little bit unusually. We're one of 10 states that are so-called state supervised and county administered. That means in each of our counties we have county workers who are being paid by the county. They're under the Job and Family Service Director, who's reporting to the Board of County Commissioners. In the case of the two charter counties, they're reporting to the county executive. But those county workers are using a state-run IT system to implement a whole host of federal in state rules in their day-to-day work. So you've got this shared system of responsibility in which the state is setting up that framework, setting up the rules, but the counties are managing their own staff with support from the state, but they're managing their own staff and their resources and trying to do the best job they can. So with a state-run IT system, we see interesting things happens. You get the best and best and worst of both worlds, in the sense that it's a statewide system. All the counties are using it, but if there's an issue that crops up, whether that's integrating a new software module or their policy changes, it can affect the whole system as well. And so sometimes you see some hiccups in how our Ohio benefit system works. That's what the IT system is called. And this the administration is shared between the state and counties, and the financing of the system is shared between the state and counties as well. So in Ohio, we like local control a lot, and so we have state help as well. So we have a state appropriation in the ODJFS budget that comes out to counties. It's around $44 million a year. Unfortunately, both that SNAP appropriation and the Medicaid appropriation have pretty much been flat funded for about 15 years. We got a boost during so-called Medicaid unwinding a few years ago to kind of work through some of those Medicaid cases, because there had not been redetermination going on for a couple of years during the COVID pandemic. But we, across the system, our counties really have not been fully staffed for a number of years. Most counties have had to leave positions open, and they've faced staff turnover issues. And so we're going into this, without our full staff regimen, I guess. Counties have skin in the game here. I think that's important to note. Counties are required by state law to make a required financial contribution to the administrative side of things. It's called the mandated share. There's a formula in state law. We don't need to go into it, but it works out to about $40 million a year across all the counties. That goes to SNAP and Medicaid administration. About half of that generally is going to be used for SNAP. But you also see individual counties who are adding local resources to administrative purposes as well. And those local contributions will both through the mandated share and through the more discretionary ones will help to pull down the federal match that the previous speakers have talked about. At the same time, counties are under all sorts of financial pressure, and even in the human services world. I'll mention one in children's services, where we've seen many counties, even that have a children's services levy, have to go back to the commissioners and ask for general funds to meet the needs in that system. So a lot of challenges, but important to remember counties do have a lot of financial responsibility in the system already. Next slide, please. So when we talk about SNAP eligibility determination, it's not an easy program to administer. The SNAP program looks at the household budget, not just the income side, but looks at the expense side, as Rachel was talking about in her remarks. And there's a formula that's put together that looks at the kind of basically the budget for the household. So we need to know information about the rent, about the utilities, about income. We need to know how many folks are in the household. And then that's all taken into account. So it is a complex program that requires data. There's an initial interview at the time of application. Generally would take like 45 minutes, could take longer, depending on what's going on, in that particular case. But it is, if you contrast it, let's say, with the earned income tax credit, which is done through through federal taxes. That is, that is a much more simpler program than SNAP, and that is a choice that's been made at the federal level to construct the program in that manner. Now, with that said, states have choices under federal law about how they can choose to do client reporting. Ohio and most other states use what's called simplified reporting. So we're not requiring individuals to report every single month for large part of the client population. It's a 6-month recertification where we're going to ask them to, re-verify a lot of that, income and budgetary information that they submitted before, and just make sure that they are still eligible, and then recalculate the benefits. So when we talk about error rates, really important, especially, we're talking with policymakers to make them understand that error rates are not a measure of fraud. They are not a measure of fraud. They include both under and over payments, and they are a result of errors that have taken place either on the part of the client or sometimes on the part of the agency. So maybe the client initially didn't report that they've got a second job. Maybe there is didn't report something about their lease situation. On the agency side, you'll see, again, maybe certain information wasn't taken into account. Maybe there was a mistake made about, this individual was getting paid on a weekly basis, and the agency may have thought they were getting paid on a bi-weekly basis, things like that. So it's not a measure of fraud. It's about calculation of the benefits, and it's really important to understand that. So what happens each year in terms of the calculation of the so-called state error rate is that the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services will audit a sample of SNAP cases, a little over 1,000 cases, randomly selected across the state, and they will audit those according to federal guidelines and essentially rework the case from the ground up. It is a total rework. They will even re-interview the individual client and re-verify all the information. So that error rate may be statistically valid at the state level, but some counties, especially smaller counties, have few or no error rates pulled sometimes in 1 year. And so, we don't really have county error rates officially at the present time because the sample size just doesn't allow it. In terms of our error rate itself, Hope mentioned that the most recently published FNS data has us at 9%. Typically in recent years, we've been around 7%, so a lot closer to the 6% threshold that was mentioned in terms of the benefit cost share. We certainly believe that working together with the state, we can make a lot of progress in bringing down the error rate. It was 6% actually before the transition to the Ohio benefits IT system about 8 or 10 years ago. So we've got a lot of optimism that with some hard work we can get there down to 6%. Next slide. And I think I know a lot of you on the call are advocates and kind of want to know what are some of the talking points here. Previous speakers talked about the timing of these changes. It's really important for policymakers and everyone else involved to understand that the administrative cuts are taking place in the current budget biennium. Okay, but the potential benefits cost share is something that will be determined or would take place in the next budget biennium and be an issue for the next governor, because that would be October of 2027. And Hope mentioned this. I think it was worth repeating as well. So what to the extent that we can work on the error rate now for this upcoming federal fiscal year, that provides our baseline for the first year of the benefits cost share. Now, what's important again about timing is that county governments in Ohio work on a calendar year budget. So right now, going into the fall, they are working on putting together their budget for 2026. Our members are very, very concerned about the prospect of potential administrative cuts. And so many of our counties are already in a hiring freeze situation, kind of waiting to see what happens. If we do not get additional help from the legislature to help fill that gap over the next year, you're going to see probably some furloughs and probably some job cuts during 2026 if some additional help is not forthcoming from the legislature. Now, fortunately, we've had a number of conversations with ODJFS, and they are going to help us with our advocacy in the legislature. So I think, I'm optimistic that, we're going to get something done. I don't know about the timing of that, but again, this bullet point here about, making those investments now in the county JFS system, both for the IT side, the training, the staffing, that will help us do the hard work that's needed to bring our error rate down below 6%. It's a very attainable goal. As I said, Ohio has been at that level in the past. You'll see some states with double-digit error rates. We're not those, and we have historically been below the national average. We've done a pretty good job with our error rate here in the state of Ohio. I think also in these discussions, there may be a tendency on the part of some policymakers to think that we can basically just adopt some more IT investments, some AI or different types of software, and that's going to cure these issues. Well, leveraging technology is an important piece of the puzzle. And I think especially in the long run, and I know the department has a number of plans in place to make changes to Ohio benefits, and also at the county level. I know a lot of our counties are looking at doing things that would help caseworkers, kind of manage through the eligibility determination process. And those updates have been ongoing, but technology by itself is not going to get this done. Again, we need to maintain our staffing levels. We need to continue with being able to do the training that we're doing in order to have a successful outcome. So, yeah, that's basically what we need to do. And I think we'll go to questions.
Thank you so much, Rachel, Hope, and John, for sharing your expertise and your review of the reconciliation bill. We have some questions that are coming in. If you have questions, please plug them into the Q&A box and we will get to those. So the first question, maybe to start with Rachel, what are the federal guidelines for client reporting in comparison to Ohio using simplified reporting?
Yeah, this is a really important question. So client reporting is a state option. I would say there aren't federal must-haves. There are a few choices that states can make, and they all have pros and cons. So a little history lesson. Way back at the beginning or earlier on in the program, SNAP used to be under monthly reporting. Then it went to quarterly reporting. Then there were these options introduced, and actually Ohio was one of the states that piloted it, where you had the option of change reporting and simplified reporting. So the way the frequency and type of reporting required has evolved over time, really as SNAP became more and more connected with working households who had variable income because they were hourly wage workers. So the main choices that we have are simplified reporting is the most effective, efficient as well as the best for our error rate. So in general, simplified reporting is the recommendation. FNS would say the same thing, I believe. So there have been over time some consideration, some discussion even in the legislature about different types of reporting, including what's called change reporting. If you look across states, there's only a few that use change reporting, and they are some of the highest error rate states. So, for example, Mississippi passed a law several years ago requiring change reporting, and they have a double-digit error rate because that means every time someone gets one extra shift or one less shift, they need to be calling into the county and reporting that, and that creates chaos in a system. So simplified reporting still requires households to report any new income if it puts them over an income threshold that would make them ineligible. So it doesn't mean that they don't still have a reporting obligation. It just takes away needing to report those little small changes that are natural when you are working in a hourly wage job. So I hope that answers the question. Strongly, think it's wise that Ohio has stuck with simplified reporting.
Excellent. Thank you so much. The next question, are there any policy changes left that could impact the error rates to make the eligibility determination less complex and thus fewer mistakes that we could advocate for, that folks on the webinar could advocate for, or have all state options been eliminated?
So I'll take a first swing at this one, and then John or Hope, feel free to chime in. So no, state options have not been eliminated, thankfully, because those are important levers that the state has. As John was saying, this is an achievable goal to get below the 6% error threshold. Some things that I know the department is already considering a lot of options, things that they can explore that might help with that. I think they're being very thoughtful and not jumping to policy changes. They're really studying the issue. One just concrete example I would give that is a possibility is we have a fairly complex standard utility allowance. We have 4 levels of a standard utility allowance that someone can get based on the type of utilities that they pay for. That is more complicated than other states have. So that's the type of policy the state could look at and say, is there a way to simplify this, make it easier for the counties to implement the policy consistently across the state? And, is that going to be a silver bullet to solve, to totally drop the error rate? No, but I think it's going to be a combination of those targeted strategies that could move the needle on the error rate. I don't know, John, if there's anything you would add to that.
I would just say that, we've been told that, ODJFS has a number of waiver proposals that are under active consideration. I think they've already made some requests to FNS about some of them, and there are others, I think, in the works. But as I said, it's a complicated program, and to the extent that we can simplify that initial eligibility determination process, those waivers will come in handy.
Thank you. The next question here, can you share your thoughts on how we can advocate with our county commissioners on this as they're developing their fiscal year 2026 budgets, especially for folks on the webinar who are food pantry or food bank providers?
I'm happy to take that one. I think advocacy has to take place at 2 levels. We've got to have state level advocacy. We've got to have county level advocacy. I think just number one, reminding the commissioners about the importance of the SNAP program. We do have data out there about how many people in each county are on SNAP. I think talking about the way SNAP helps to support families, and I think talking about the need that the county JFS is kind of the linchpin of kind of doing those applications in a timely fashion and doing them right. That's going to help the folks in the county, first of all, but if everyone's doing it, then it's going to help the whole state. But I think it's commissioners, they look out on the horizon, they see all sorts of potential issues out there, and whether it's the national economy slowing down potentially, or We have a property tax repeal initiative. They're out there gathering signatures right now, which would, obviously be devastating, at the county level. So they're looking at all that, and I think the message is, let's stay the course, maintain our staffing levels, make sure we can focus on our quality control and kind of get the job done. And that's going to be our message at the state level as well. Let's no need to panic. Let's do what we're doing and get focused on the job at hand.
Thank you so much. I'm going to combine some questions here that are asked about what factors into the error rate and kind of how it's calculated. So one question, does SNAP skimming factor into the error rate? So maybe remind everyone what SNAP skimming is and does that factor into the error rate? And then what kind of data is collected about what factors into the error rate, and can we identify kind of what pieces of the error rate are attributed to different sources? And I think this is also a great lead into our part 2 webinar next week.
Yeah, well, I will take the second part of the question. I think Hope would be better to address the EBT skimming question if you want to, Hope, because you've been doing a lot of work on that. But I'll just, in terms of some of the contributing factors, we are going to do a deep dive on what causes error rates and how to fix them. And really with a focus on being partners in accuracy, right? The stakes are so high now for this error rate that we really all, I think, need to play a role in being part of the solution. As John mentioned, the error rate is actually a combination of an overpayment and an underpayment, and those percentages are actually added together. It's terrible math. When I was going to school, a 4 minus 2 equals 2, but in error rate land, a 4 minus 2 equals 6. So a 4% overpayment and a 2% underpayment equals a 6% error rate. So there are some ways in which the actual way of calculating these errors did not change in this bill. It's just that it's being utilized for a very different purpose than the original accountability that it was designed to provide. So we will go much deeper on this. Some of the things, the other thing I would say is about half of the errors on average are agency caused and about half are client caused, meaning a client made a mistake or an agency made a mistake. So that means there's room for both sides of that equation to improve. And I think that's why we really have to partner together to improve our messaging, simplify our notices, right, and improve some processes and use technology, as John was saying, on the county side to kind of squeeze down that error from both ends.
Thanks,
But
Rachel.
yes, come to next week's webinar. We'll go into more depth.
Thanks, Rachel. And on the question of SNAP skimming, unfortunately, the SNAP skimming issue is not factored into any of these conversations, unfortunately. So not related to the error rate in any way, shape, or form. But I will say, and this is a great opportunity to talk about how to mitigate SNAP skimming, is states are kind of taking a state-by-state approach on tackling SNAP skimming, in trying to physically chip those SNAP cards, the EBT cards, to kind of prevent them from being so easily skimmed. And so there is an opportunity in Ohio. There's two state bills in the legislature to kind of address this. And when we talk about the state administrative costs and that balance changing from a 50-50 to a 75-25, there is an opportunity to kind of maximize on that 50-50 while we still can before that cost shift takes place next year, to explore helping use to help our state's cards to mitigate SNAP skimming. So, and I will also say, unfortunately, since the federal government stopped reimbursing benefits, what's happening in reporting, there's no real data, unfortunately, because neighbors have kind of lost the incentive to report that they have been skimmed because there has been no mechanism to reimburse them. And so unfortunately, it's still running rampant, and it has no impact on the error rate at all. But there is a new opportunity and increased interest to address SNAP skimming, especially with the 50-50 match while it's still in place.
Thank you so much. A question here, kind of going back to John's overview of Ohio's county system. Can you talk about what the structure is in other states if it's not county administered, and kind of what that means for the efficiency of our benefits administration in Ohio? Just briefly, since we have the expert here.
Yeah, so a lot of states, are using state employees. Um, they may or may not have local offices. They'll have local offices of some kind, but they are, it is a state organization. And Ohio, we do it a little differently, as I said, with this blend of, it is a um, state IT system with state rules, but we have county workers, and we're able to tailor not just SNAP, but we're able to tailor some of those social services to the surrounding community. And the idea is that um, you know through the county commissioners, through the county structure, you're going to get a more sort of nuanced, locally driven response to the needs of that community. And as I said, our error rates have historically been below the national average. We think it's worked well in Ohio. It'd be nice if the system were better supported and better staffed by the state, but that's not necessarily something that would be solved by state control. Because at least in this structure, a certain individual county wants to put in more money into the system. Many of them will do that, and will do that. So it's an interesting situation. So we've got a number of other, we've got, like I said, 9 other states that do that, including some fairly large ones.
Yeah, and I'll just add from a national perspective that we have done some research on this, and Ohio runs a pretty efficient cost per case compared to other states. There are some other county administered states that would be considered less efficient than the national average. Ohio is not only on error rates have they generally been overperforming the national average, but also in the costs. Now, John mentioned the system's been flat funded for 15 years, so that is part of it, and we are going to need some more investment, I think, to stay below the 6% error rate, at least in the near term. But overall, I would say that Ohio is considered a high performer, and so we shouldn't be thinking about breaking too much of that success, in my opinion.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions about kind of specifics about the changes. So one question about the expanded work reporting for parents with children and whether or not there's an exception if the children have disabilities. And then also a question about how eligibility might change for children of immigrant parents. And so my question, I think, is, do we know those answers yet? And what can we share at this time?
Yeah, this definitely worthy of another deeper dive as more guidance comes out from the federal government and how the state decides to implement. But I think we know the general parameters. So for parents with children, if the parent is disabled, they would be they would be eligible for an exemption themselves. If the child is disabled and the parent has a caregiving responsibility, then in theory that caregiving responsibility is what would be an exception or an exemption from the rule. That is, though, to John's earlier point, a complex process that is found out in a long interview. There is documented requirements for documentation. And so it's not just like automatic that if you have a disabled child in this example, that would automatically trigger an exemption. You would have to go through a complex process of proving it. So the impacts are going to be both on folks whose eligibility is actually lost, and there will also be impacts on folks who should be exempt but simply weren't able to navigate the process of proving it. And on the immigrant question, in general, if that child had a status of asylee, if the child themselves was an asylee or refugee, There was no provision in the law that said that eligibility is still protected for children with those statuses. It was just a loss of eligibility for those statuses. But that is one of those areas that we do not have detailed guidance on yet, and so implementation is not imminent. And I think we should do, a deeper dive on it once we have more guidance about how it will roll out. The most important thing I would say right now, if you're representing a client or you yourself are a household that has one of those statuses, is you can update your status, because like I said, many people will have had an adjusted status. They may now be a legal permanent resident, but the computer system thinks that they are still a refugee. So those kind of updates need to be made at the person level to make sure that when this does get implemented, it's done accurately.
Great. And on that same topic, what's the best way for attendees today to keep track of updated guidance from USDA on these changes as it kind of trickles out?
I think it's really tough right now. We can certainly, there is on the FNS website, there's new guidance. That's where it gets posted. What's where I learn about it. We will try to keep doing some updated posts through the Center for Community Solutions website and do new webinars as information comes out. But I think in general, we want to just be waiting for guidance to come from ODJFS, because it really matters how Ohio is implementing and when Ohio is implementing. So I wouldn't want to misconstrue federal guidance coming out to mean that is effective immediately in Ohio. So I do think staying close to what the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services and our county JFSs are putting out, that's really the most valuable messaging for residents and for families who are going to be impacted by these changes.
Great. There's also a great question about kind of the ripple effects of these changes, and if there are concerns that these changes and the loss of SNAP funds will increase food deserts in Ohio. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I will say that even nationally, the National Grocers Association and many of their affiliates, it says my internet connection is unstable, so if you guys can't hear me, Rachel, take it away. But anyway, the National Grocers Association and a lot of their affiliates were very active on the Hill on this for that exact reason, Sarah. So I would take a look at some of their materials. I'm trying to dig some of them up right now on some of their estimates and guesstimates on the ripple effects as you shared, but that is a major, 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 major concern. And many of, especially of independent grocers, of rural grocers, of smaller retailers, the Walmarts of the world, not so much active on this, but our National Grocers Association and their independent grocer affiliates are incredibly, incredibly concerned on just that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I am also thinking of this in terms of when the law was under consideration, we needed to have a lot of those conversations, and we should continue to talk about those impacts with our federal representatives. Um, and at the same time, I think there's no reason that Ohio should do, I think that we can fully invest in our system that is needed to meet the gauntlet that was thrown down, essentially by Congress to lower our error rate. I think we have the resources in Ohio. We should, those rural groceries are very impacted by SNAP dollars. And so we can't let anything jeopardize the SNAP program operating in Ohio and being fully utilized in Ohio. So I'm taking let's control what we can approach and continue to educate federal leadership about future changes to federal law that would make things easier on Ohio going forward.
Okay, excellent. We are now at 1 o'clock. I want to say there are still some really great questions in the Q&A about the error rate, questions about technology, questions kind of diving into the specifics there, which is a really great segue for me to share the information for next week's webinar. It is our part 2 webinar, Friday, September 12th, same time, same place, except for there's a separate registration link, so technically not the same place. And we hope that we will see you there. And let me go back to today's speakers so that you have the emails for everyone. All of these slides will be sent out. And thank you so much for your time. And thank you to our panelists for a great conversation. Bye, everyone.